This is the story of how a colonial governor lost his head. The Anglo-Ashanti Wars were four conflicts between the Asante Empire and the Akan interior of what is now Ghana and the British in the 19th century. The First War, 1823 and 1831, seen by the British as part of their anti-slavery campaign, saw the British suffer a defeat. The Second War, 1863 to 1864, ended in a stalemate. By 1874, when the Third War ended in a peace treaty, the British had claimed the rest of the Gold Coast as a crown colony, with Accra as its capital from 1877. The Fourth War, 1894 to 1896, ended in a British victory. The Asante were forced to sign a treaty of protection. The Ashanti, king of all Asante, and other leaders, were exiled. After a failed revolt in 1900, led by Ya Asantewaa, the Queen Mother, Asante territory was finally annexed as part of the Crown Colony. The British were protecting the coastal people, primarily Fonte and the inhabitants of Accra, from Asante incursions. In 1806, the British ended slavery on the Gold Coast. This bankrupted the British African Company of Merchants who owned the slave forts along the coast. It also affected the Asante economy, which was dependent on the slave trade. At its height, 10,000 slaves a year were being exported from the area. The British took over the forts and extended their influence into the interior in their campaign against slavery. They were also concerned that the Ashanti were still involved in slave trading. Thus the two sides came to blows. Another dimension of the conflict was the imperial rivalry between the British who supported the Fonte and the Dutch who supported the Asante. The later wars were concerned more with the British desire to impose its control on the Asante, to the extent of humiliating them. It took almost a century, however, from the earliest conflict of 1806 to 1807 for the colonial power to defeat what was a sophisticated, well-organized African state. The Asante Empire was a confederacy and possessed many consultative and democratic features, even though its economy was based on slavery. The Ashanti shared power with others, and was ultimately answerable to his subjects for his leadership of the state. This system was replaced by the rule of British colonial and district officers. Throughout this time, the Asante were fiercely proud and independent, and won the respect of the British. The result of this long history of mutual interaction between Asante and European powers is that the Asante have the greatest amount of historiography in sub-Saharan Africa. The British regarded the Asante as one of the more civilized African peoples, cataloging their religious, familial and legal systems. Born in the largest Irish county of Cork, Sir Charles McCarthy was a knighted lieutenant colonel in the Royal African Corps before his appointment as governor of Senegal in 1812. With injuries sustained in two different wars in 1794 and 1798, McCarthy had seen his fair share of battles. The latter of his battle wounds was received when he fought off a French privateer while serving in the 2nd Regiment of the Lecomte de Walsh-Serrant of the British Paid Irish Brigade. The brigade was disbanded in 1798, and in 1799, McCarthy was commissioned to serve in the Royal African Corps, a British penal military unit composed of deserters and prisoners of war, culprits from the hulks as they were so popularly called. The prisoners were mainly British-captured French soldiers. His émigré French father, Jean-Gabriel Gérault, had only adopted his mother's maiden name upon advice from his uncle Thaddeus McCarthy, a British captain, because of the existing feud between the French and the British at that time. When his father died, Charles McCarthy, an only child, was adopted by his uncle, the Comte de Merve. McCarthy soon became a naturalized Frenchman and assumed his uncle's title upon his demise. During his appointment in Africa as a British colonial governor, McCarthy had been a major supporter of the campaign to abolish the slave trade on the continent. At the time, slavery had already been abolished in the United Kingdom, but the trade was still in full swing in West Africa. His excellent service to the crown led to his being knighted in 1820. McCarthy only became acquainted with the Ashanti Empire and the Gold Coast when it became a crown colony in 1821, with McCarthy as her governor. The Ashanti Empire was embedded in the heart of what is known today as the nation of Ghana, and they resisted colonial rule for the better part of the 19th century. They were also in a long-standing feud with the rival Fonte Confederacy on the Gold Coast, and their wars soon became a matter of concern for the British, who were involved in trade relations with the Fonte. The British sided with them, and subsequently became enemies of the Ashanti. Under the distinguished leadership of their fearless leader, King Asai Bonsu, and their sophisticated bureaucracy, the Ashanti had the best independent militia in all West Africa. They won an earlier war with the Fonte, which broke out in 1806, with the British giving in to their demands for the head of Kwadwo Atibu, the ruler of one of the Fonte cities. The British had underestimated the Ashanti army at the time, and they did so once again in the Battle of Nsamanko. McCarthy declared war against the Ashanti in late 1823 after their continuous disruption and raid of Fonte cities, which were under British protection, seeing their actions as a direct slap to the face, one to which he wasn't prepared to turn the other cheek. After organizing the defenses of Cape Coast, McCarthy set out with an expedition of some 80 men of the Royal African Colonial Corps, RACC, 170 men of the Cape Coast Militia, and 240 Fanti tribesmen under their local chiefs. He was accompanied by a captain and an ensign of the 2nd West India Regiment, as aides-de-camp, a surgeon of the same regiment, and J.T. Williams, his colonial secretary. This was not the only part of his force. 3 other groups of infantry were in the region, one of 600 regulars of the RACC and 3,000 native levies, one of 100 regulars and militia and 2,000 levies, under Major Alexander Gordon Lane, and a third of 300 regulars and militia and 6,000 levies. The plan was for the 4 groups to converge, and then engage the enemy with overwhelming force. On the night of the 20th, still without having joined forces with the other 3 groups, McCarthy's force camped by a tributary of the Pra River. The next day, at around 2 p.m., they encountered a large enemy force of around 10,000 men. Believing that the Ashanti army contained several disaffected groups whose chiefs were willing to defect, McCarthy instructed the band to play God Save the Queen loudly. The Ashanti responded by approaching closer, beating war drums, and his beliefs were swiftly dispelled. Fighting started shortly thereafter. The 2 sides were separated by a 60 feet wide stream, which the Ashanti attempted to cross by felling trees for bridges. The British at first shot the Ashanti who tried to cross the exposed tree trunks. However, the British forces were lightly supplied, the bearers bringing the supplies up in the rear, which included most of the gunpowder and ammunition, mostly fled after hearing the firing in the distance and encountering deserters straggling back. 4 cases of supplies arrived. The first was opened, and the shot inside was distributed, but the other 3 were found to contain only macaroni. As the British ran out of ammunition, the Ashanti advanced across the river. Most of the Fonte militia fled, and the British who stood and fought were overwhelmed in hand-to-hand combat. McCarthy, along with the ensign and his secretary, attempted to fall back. He was wounded by gunfire, however, and killed himself rather than be taken prisoner. McCarthy's gold-rimmed skull was later used as a drinking cup by the Ashanti rulers. Ensign Wetherell was killed whilst trying to defend McCarthy's body, and Williams taken prisoner. On his return, he related that he had only survived through being recognized by an Ashanti chief for whom he had done a small favor, and was spared. He was held prisoner for several months, locked in a dwelling which he shared with the severed heads of McCarthy and Wetherell, kept as trophies of war.